We're going to be talking about the Rambam, about Maimonides. And to think that here you have, right, a great doctor, philosopher, rabbi who lived over 800 years ago, and his works are studied in departments of philosophy, Judaic studies, medicine, ethics, and in the most traditional yeshivot. So we're talking obviously about an incredible individual that the impact lives on. We're going to focus specifically on the controversy that relates to the guide for the perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim. That's what we're going to be calling it tonight, the Moreh Nevuchim. And we have to realize that the text has been controversial from the time it appeared towards the end of the 12th century until today, but for different reasons. And perhaps we're not going to have the ability to fully appreciate why in the 13th century it was controversial. But I'm going to perhaps focus when we get to that point on why today there are those who view it as a controversial text. That's what we're going to focus on. But I would like to start off with the following. I hope you are able, give me a thumbs up if you see here the Wyzak. Do you see that? Thumbs up. Oh, Ken is always good. Thank you. Thank you. Now, the Wyzak, what is the Wyzak? So it's known as the Weizmann automated computer. It was the first computer in Israel, one of the first large-scale stored program electronic computers in the ganze Welt, in the whole world. Why is this important? And we're going to have to connect it to Maimonides. Why is this important? Israel is known as the startup nation. And we've all read about it. We are quite proud of it. I once met a professor in Weizmann, Professor Kanai, and he mentioned to me that you should know the credit for Israel being on the cutting edge of technology and computer science is the Wyzak. You have to appreciate the Wyzak. And then he told me that there is one person that really gets the credit for bringing this computer to Israel and really being the one, he's the impetus for startup nation. And it's an individual by the name of Professor Chaim Leib Pekeris, 1908, 1993. He was a mathematician. He was an MIT. He was a Zionist, always a big supporter of the state of Israel. There was once, in one of the times that he was honored later on in the state of Israel, so Teddy Kollek got up and he said, it's a pity that we can't share publicly how you were helpful to the Jewish state in the years leading to 1948, to the independence. So it indicates that he was quite helpful with ways that America would not be happy. Perhaps technology transferred from MIT. Ich weiß nicht, I don't know. But the name Chaim Leib Pekeris is an important name and one that we should appreciate when we talk about startup nation. He's actually mishpacha, a cousin or an uncle with Yossi Derman. I've talked with Yossi over the years about Chaim Leib Pekeris. He comes from MIT to Weizmann, and he says, I will come if you go ahead and invest in this computer. So Weizmann wasn't sure about it. They got a group of these experts. There was one expert by the name of Albert, who was skeptical. And Albert wondered, why would a small country like Israel need a big computer? And this Albert obviously is not an average Albert, it's Albert Einstein. So Albert Einstein was not supportive of the idea of bringing the computer to the state of Israel. It was brought in the early 1950s. There's some interesting stories that relate to when it was, when they kicked in voltage for the first time and they brought dignitaries, but the problem was that it turned into fireworks. They have their all kind of interesting stories that relate to Chaim Leib Pekeris. Now, why am I starting off with Chaim Leib Pekeris? after my grandfather passed away, Rabbi Aaron Milevsky, my father, Olav Shalom, inherited many of books and booklets and writings. And a few years ago, I was going through one of these small booklets that my grandfather got as a gift from someone, and a letter fell out. A letter fell out. And here's a copy of the letter that fell out addressed to my grandfather, Lichvod Harav Aaron Milevsky, Rehov HaMeiri. It's from 1981 with the heading from Machon Weizmann LeMada, from the Weizmann Institute of Science. So in paragraph number 1, he writes, Ani sholeach lechvodo, I'm sending you a little booklet that relates to the Rambam. Fine, nothing that was too exciting or fascinating. But the second paragraph is the one that is more interesting for me, and I think a good start for our discussion tonight. The author of this letter, Chaim Leib Pekeris, who writes this letter to my grandfather, notes that bevikuach shehitorer lifnei ha'amra'a leTel Aviv. In other words, I had an argument before takeoff towards Tel Aviv from Zurich. Huftati lishma, I was surprised to hear mepi Chabadnik Sair, from a young Chabadnik, shelanu, for us, asur likro et hamoreh nevuchim. For us, Chabadskers, it is prohibited to read the Moreh Nevuchim, rak ligdolei haTorah mutar. Only to the great Torah scholars it's permissible. So for Professor Pekeris, this was fascinating. Why would there be an issue of reading the Moreh Nevuchim? How on earth could you have Maimonides in the room and ask him to keep quiet? He was fascinated. Now, why would Dr. Pekeris be writing to my grandfather? So Dr. Pekeris was born in Alitus. Alitus, and of course the Wolves know very well about Alitus because they visited Alitus. Alitus is where my grandfather was from. So therefore it appears that there was a relationship in Alitus between Professor Pekeris and my Saba. Interesting. So that's what we're going to start off with, just to give you an idea. It's controversial, starting off with Dr. Pekeris. A little bit about Maimonides' life, a little bit about the Rambam before we enter into why is it controversial today? What issues could we have in the world we live in today with the works of the Rambam? So now, the Rambam was born 1135, some say 1138, in Cordoba, Spain, southern Spain, which is an area, the territory of southern Spain, Andalus, is controlled by the Muslims. These are tolerant Muslims. This is already post the golden age of Spanish Jewry, which according to some we've discussed in the past was in 1066 with the massacre that occurred with the son of Shmuel HaNagid. But he still lived in a tolerant environment where the Muslims were the thinkers. The Muslims were the mathematicians. Unfortunately, that changes in 1148. Maimonides is still a young child or a teenager, and his difficulties begin. And we find him eventually in Fez, Morocco, okay? And it appears that during that time, he had to practice externally some of the Islamic practices. That was the norm. And to what extent, there's a debate, but I'll share with you a fascinating statement he makes that we have his writings, that he shares with us that in the year 1165, he finally arrives in Akko, in Eretz Israel. And he tells us that you should know on the 3rd of Sivan, Yatsati min Hayam, I was finally, right, the difficult journey by sea came to an end. And he, Bati la'ako, and he adds the words, Nitzalti min hashmad. Nitzalti, there was a hatzalah, there was a salvation from shmad. Shmad is a term when we Jews are forced to practice another faith. We use the word shmad, gzerat shmad. And Maimonides uses that term to describe the experience and his feeling of being finally in Eretz Israel. And he tells us, Yom ze nadarti sheyeh yom sason v'simcha. It's a day that I committed that for eternity will be one of happiness. He continues in that letter describing that he eventually makes it to Jerusalem and he entered into Habayit HaGadol VeHaKadosh, which created a whole new debate. You know, there's a major discussion about the status of the Temple Mount. Is it permissible to make your way up to the Temple Mount or not? A lot of literature, a lot of discussions, but some turn to these words of Maimonides that it appears to tell us that he did make his way LaBayit HaGadol VeHaKadosh ve'itpalalti bo. Nevertheless, Maimonides is not able to remain in the land of Israel, and I think we all know that he lands up in Egypt. He lands up in Egypt. He was in Israel perhaps for 6 months. He lands up in Egypt and lives in Old Cairo, Fustat. Chaim Musaji could tell you a little bit about Fustat. He also mentions that there is a tradition up until this day that he remembers from a few decades ago in Egypt, where there was a synagogue that has a mikvah, and there's a tradition that the Rambam was in that mikvah, and people would go to that mikvah, Jews and Arabs alike, Jews and Muslims alike, to go ahead and get cured. Rambam is living in Egypt, and his major, the most significant work he had was to address the problem of the Karaites. You know, it's very interesting. You study literature from the 8th century on. We have Rabbinic Judaism, which in general we are followers of. And then you have the movement of the Karaim, disciples of a fellow called Anan. And naturally, if you would analyze these movements throughout the 9th, 10th, and 11th century, one would guess that if Judaism does survive, you would have these two tracks, the Karaites and the traditional Jews. And by the way, they did live together for a period of time. In the Cairo Gniza, they actually found a ksuva where the Chosen was a rabbinic Jew, the Kala was from a Karaite family. They came with different minhagim. So she, for example, would not use light on Shabbos. So he committed in the ksuva itself not to force her to practice her Judaism like the rabbis. So Karaim should have been in existence perhaps for many, many decades, but nevertheless, they vanished. And it appears, this is what I feel, they had a 1-2 punch. Punch number one was Reb Sadia Gaon. And number two, the one that really wiped them out was Maimonides, because Maimonides saw it as a major problem in Egypt. He notes that there were women that would not go to the mikvah, would pour water on themselves because that's how they understand the text. And he saw it as a threat due to his personality, due to his ability to influence others. He establishes rabbinic courts, education, and he changes Egyptian Jewry, and the Karaites are on the losing end of it. He survived due to the fact that he had a brother by the name of David. I read in some sources that there was an inheritance in the family that was invested in precious jewels. And David was the one who was traveling to go ahead and support the family. David, unfortunately, landed up in India, and 1177, his boat, the boat he's on, sinks and he dies. This was devastating for Maimonides, a brother he was close to, a brother that supported him. And this brother left a wife and a child, and now suddenly became his responsibility. It appears that he had a very difficult year afterwards. Perhaps even we could label it as a depression due to the significant loss. And as a result, he had to roll up his sleeves, and he was no longer only guiding in halachic matters and establishing batei dinim in Fustat, but he started practicing medicine. Eventually, he becomes the doctor, the physician for Salahuddin, and we know Rambam as the doctor as a result. Now, briefly, before we get to the Moreh Nevuchim, we'll talk a little bit about his letters, the Igrot, and some other works of the Rambam. Igrot HaRambam, for example, when the Rambam is still a young man in North Africa, many Jews had to practice externally and live a life as Muslims. and they became familiar with Muslim traditions and what they do utter and how they live their life externally. They continued practicing their Judaism similar to the Spain, perhaps, of the 15th century, with what the Jews had to do regarding the Christians. There was a person who wrote a letter to some Chacham, to Chacham. This Chacham was not living in Fes, was not living in a region that had that challenge. And the question this Chacham was asked, what is the status of people who have to, unfortunately, practice Islamic minhagim publicly? The Chacham responded by saying, you should know that they are Ovdei Avodah Zarah. If you as a Jew publicly, right, practice like a Muslim, you are an Oved Avodah Zarah, and all the mitzvot you do afterwards are worthless. And this Chacham added, it is a Yahareg ve'al Ya'avor. In other words, what you guys are doing is practicing idolatry, since in our tradition, if a Jew is told you have two options, either to practice Avodah Zarah idolatry or give your life, you are obligated to give your life. All you Jews there in North Africa should just give your life. The letter had a very devastating impact on the Jewish community because they had no choice. They were not going to give their life, and they continued practicing as Muslims do, at least publicly. They were devastated. So a young rabbi, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, he's in his mid-20s. He wrote a letter to dispute this rabbi, and he called him some names. He said he's a fool. He's a fool because he doesn't live here. He's a fool because he called Islam Avodah Zarah. He is a fool because he spoke negatively about the Jewish people. And look in our tradition, what happens to Moshe, what happens to Eliyahu, what happens to Yeshayahu. Throughout our Bible, when a person is critical of the Jewish people, he's punished. And this fool is causing discouragement, and he is wrong. The Rambam writes a letter, it is known as the Igeret Hashmad, where he gives a tremendous amount of support to the Jews who are going through the difficulty. And he noted that they have to understand that obviously if you have the option of leaving such a region, you should, but while you are there, don't in any way minimize the significance of the mitzvot you do. It became extremely popular, this letter. And the Rambam gave a tremendous chizuk and boost to those who were were struggling with this major difficulty. Guilt, as we all know, is the most painful of all afflictions. The chizuk the Rambam gave was simply incredible. And so too, there was a challenge that the Yemenite Jews had, significant challenge, where there were the Muslims were telling them, you guys should give up on your Judaism. And the Muslims were proving to them from Tanakh that God Almighty wants you to follow the teachings of Muhammad. And it says in the Torah that Yishmael will be increased me'od me'od. And if you listen carefully, me'od sounds like Muhammad. So it seems to indicate that you Jews should be following Muhammad. So they had significant challenges in Yemen. In addition, another challenge they had was that there was a fellow who claimed to be the Messiah. Again, Rambam gives a tremendous amount of chizuk, support, to people who are going through difficulty. And that is, I think, what we could take with us more than anything else. You know, it's fascinating how many good Torah Jews start their day. They start their day with walking into shul and saying Yigdal, the 13 principles of faith that are based on the work of Maimonides, on his Pirush on the Mishnah. And many people end their davening with the 13 Anima Amins, based on the teachings of Maimonides. So just, it gives you the understanding of the role he plays for the Jew to know not just how they should practice their Judaism, but what they should be thinking. And this appears in the Pirush Mishnah, which he wrote in a young age. We are all familiar with the Mishneh Torah. I think we're all familiar with the work, the Yada Chazakah of the Rambam. where he goes through all rabbinic texts and he provides and he presents to the reader everything spelled out in a very simple and clear way without the disputes. And it is organized in a way that you could find things. You know, in Talmudic literature, sometimes there are discussions that relate to Shabbos, and you'll find them in a tractate that is discussing oaths. So the Talmud is not organized in a way where you could go ahead and find things the way you would expect to. Maimonides organized the work. He was a codifier, and he wrote his work in a way that it could be easy for everyone to access the information. His decision was that it would be easy if he does not spell out original or sources for what he is teaching. And as a result, he was criticized. You know that often when you walk into a yeshiva, what they do is they'll take the works of the Rambam, they'll open up a Rambam, and this is after studying the text of the Talmud. And they're going to have difficulty in understanding how the Rambam came to such a conclusion from the text of the Talmud. So what they're going to do is they're going to go ahead and come up with insight of new ways to study the text of the Talmud to understand what the Rambam is telling us. Now, the Rambam never had that in mind when he wrote his work. The Rambam himself actually tells us that you should know that the purpose of this work is because the Torah Jew has to know Torah shebechtav and Torah shebe'al peh. So all you need is to go ahead and start off by studying the 24 books of Tanakh. And for Torah shebe'al peh, you could turn to my work here. It seems to be that that was his agenda, to push Talmud aside. However, we are here. This is all of an introduction. We are here, and we're going to start by studying why the Moreh Nevuchim is controversial. But I would like to start with a Mishnah. So here we go. Actual Limud HaTorah we're going to have here. So welcome to our Mishnah. It's a Mishnah in tractate Chagiga. Chagiga relates to the festivals, but chapter number 2 addresses some other issues. And here we go. Let's start reading together. So it works as follows. The Mishnah tells us, En dorshin be'arayot b'shlosha. In other words, the Mishnah tells us, if a Rebbe wants to get up in front of his yeshiva and present to them the prohibited relationships in areas or any areas or issues that relate to sexual matters, he should only do it if 2 students are sitting in front of him. If there are 3, there's a problem. En dorshin b'arayot b'shlosha. Do you know why? Because if he has 3 students in front of him, there's a possibility that 2 of them might enter into a discussion and not hear the master and understand what he is saying. And as the Rambam points out, you know, people have a deep desire for these violations. So a person might corrupt the law and claim he heard something from his master when actually he didn't. So therefore, the environment or the classroom has to be only with 2 students. Next statement of the Mishnah, that if you want to teach Ma'aseh Bereshit, if you want to teach those things that relate to creation, you are not to teach it to 2 students, only if there is 1 student in front of you. Do not teach it b'shnaim. Okay? Next statement, now we're going to have to clarify what exactly is this Ma'aseh Bereshit. And the last statement is, Velo, you are not allowed to teach the area of the Merkava. What exactly is the Merkava? So let's translate that word. The chariot. What exactly are the studies of the chariot? So as you know, you open the book of Yechezkel. Yechezkel had a vision. The vision he had in it, he saw the chariot of God. So the rabbis had a tradition, what the chariot refers to, what the Ofanim refer to, what the Srafim refer to, what the vision is about. So when the rabbis want to transmit that to the next generation, the Mishnah tells us they're not allowed to teach it even to 1 student, even to Yachid. The only type of student that you could teach that to is if he is one who is chacham umevin mida'ato. In other words, if it is a student that if you hint to him, he'll pick up the rest of the information, he'll have the ability to develop the rest in his mind, then you can teach him. Otherwise, no teaching the Merkava. Now, this statement seems to indicate that there were mystical teachings that in the days of the Mishnah, the rabbis were familiar with, and it was transmitted. Now, what exactly do they actually refer to? We talked about two things that are relevant for us. Ma'aseh Bereshit, Ma'aseh Merkava. So the Rambam explains the following. Ma'aseh Bereshit has to do with natural science. Natural science. My feeling is that this is not just natural science that you could figure out with empirical evidence, but rather it is a rabbinic understanding of science where they see things as signs or indications of God. In other words, if let's say I go ahead and tell you that a cat is very, very modest. So what I'm teaching you is, number one, a little bit about cats. And if I want to give a good lecture, I should really sit down and study cats and perhaps go to a cat store and analyze them. Number two, if I want to tell you that we could derive or learn modesty from a cat, I have to study Torah and the laws of modesty, and I can bring them together. And when I go ahead and do it as the rabbis do, I did not randomly pick the cat and modesty. This is a statement of the Talmud. The rabbis want us to study natural science, understand the world, but see in it as a tool of education, of one that we can inspire ourselves. There are things we could learn from it to become better people. So I think that when the Mishnah tells us that we should not teach Ma'aseh Bereshit, you should not teach the natural science unless you are in an environment that only has one student. I don't believe that this is just a class of science. I believe that there's more to it. Now, statement number two. A person, the Mishnah tells us, is not to teach Ma'aseh Merkava. So Rambam points out, as we refer to it, as Ma'aseh Eloki, things that are mystical. Mysticism, right? The work of God. So the idea of Ma'aseh Merkava plays a significant role if you are a follower of the school of the Kabbalist. Because the Kabbalist, let's analyze the word Kabbalah, right? Everyone talks about Kabbalah. It's very, very popular. And you have movie stars, right, to go ahead and study Kabbalah. And you have practices that you are told it's a good thing to do because of Kabbalah. What does the word Kabbalah mean? So the word Kabbalah means something that was received. In other words, don't think that these are made up teachings by ones who were inspired, but rather there has been a continual tradition. And therefore, Ezekiel and Navi Yechezkel had a vision, right? Navi Yechezkel had a vision. In the vision, he saw a chariot. The rabbis in the Mishnah tell us that you have to be very, very careful and sensitive as you transmit this information to the students. So obviously, the rabbis knew what the meaning or what the image referred to. The rabbis knew the Kabbalah. And then obviously, if the rabbis in the Mishnah knew it, the rabbis in the Talmud knew it. And if the rabbis in the Talmud knew it, the Gaonim knew it. And therefore, when finally the work of the Zohar appeared with mystical teachings, it is all part of a tradition. So therefore, if you walk into a yeshiva in Yerushalayim, and it's called the Yeshiva LeMekubalim, and believe it or not, such things do exist, and you hear a Kabbalistic teaching, the traditional Kabbalistic approach is that there has been a link that has not been broken. And any information you hear, perhaps there could be an insight that's new, but overall the traditions are ones who are linked. There is a Kabbalah. And now we're going to go ahead and share a statement from Maimonides, from the Rambam, in his introduction to the third section of the guide of the Moreh Nevuchim, which will seem to indicate otherwise. Now listen carefully. Maimonides, right, tells us that you should know the Ma'aseh Merkava, the image of Yecheskel, what's described in the prophet, obviously is telling us something about God. There's something mystical there. Now, he says, I'm going to analyze these verses and perhaps hint to some ideas what it represents. But you should know that due to the fact that very few people have really had this knowledge in the past, and it was only transmitted to very specific students, so therefore, the knowledge of mysticism, Maimonides tells us, Nikte'a min ha'uma kalil. Nikte'a got chopped. Min ha'uma from the nation. Kalil completely. Maimonides seems to be telling us that there is no link. There is no tradition of Kabbalah. And then he adds that you should know that anything that I'm going to explain to you that relates to Ma'aseh Merkava, right? A little bit about God and what it represents. All that, you should know, is not the byproduct of a tradition. And don't think that I experienced a revelation. Velo kibalti mipi more. I did not receive it from a teacher. Maimonides says anything that I do present to you in the mystical realm is based on my understanding. You know, I have intuition that presents it, hashara, things that I am assuming. But don't think that I experienced a revelation, and don't think that I received it from a teacher, because there's been a break in the tradition. So it appears that Maimonides was not exactly a student of the Kabbalah that we are familiar with. It does not appear that he was familiar with the teachings of the Zohar that appear towards the end of the 13th century. Now, if you are a believer that everything that appears in the Zohar is the work of Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, right? So then there seems to be a problem, because there are parallels between things that are said in the guide and those things that appear in the Zohar. So there is a problem there, unless you claim that it was actually the Zohar that got it from the Rambam, but not our discussion for now. By the way, this created controversy already in the 13th century. That basically you're telling me that the Kabbalistic teachings, which are growing in popularity towards the end in the 13th and into the 14th century, that Maimonides did not believe in it? This is very, very problematic. So there is a rabbi, he was a great Torah scholar, Rabbi Shem Tov ben Avraham Gaon. So he is a late 13th, early 14th century rabbi. He wrote a work called Migdal Oz, which actually was later on printed on the same page as the Rambam. So indicates the significance of the scholarship of this rabbi. And he shares with us a fascinating tradition that you should know. Matzati Bisfarad. So this is a rabbi, lives from 1283 into the 1300s, into the 14th century. And he shares with us that I found in Spain a very old scroll, that in that scroll it is written, Ani Moshe ben Rab Maimon, I, Moses, the son of Maimon, Yaradeti lechadrei merkava. In other words, although Maimonides in the guide and in his letters seems to reject, right, the Kabbalistic mystical approach that claims to be handed down, it appears, writes this author, that Maimonides later in his life discovered Kabbalah, and basically you could add him to the list of Mekubalim. What's really happening here is that in Spain, people were so uncomfortable with the fact that the great Maimonides was not a follower of these teachings, that the great Maimonides claims that we no longer have an unbroken chain to the mystical teachings of the rabbis, they were so disturbed. So if you don't like history, what do? You rewrite it. It's very, very easy. So they rewrote the history, and therefore this Megillah appeared. And for a rabbi like Rabbi Shem Tov, who Kabbalah was so important for him, but at the same time, respect for the Rambam was important for him, this was the best solution possible. And until this day, there are people who are convinced that Maimonides was a Kabbalist. And there are people who are convinced that you could read the Moreh Nevuchim as a work of Kabbalah. And the way they do it is by showing you that the Zohar actually is referred to. That's why there's a level of controversy. He seems to throw a wrench into a very, very significant school. Now, another area where there's a level of controversy, this one, by the way, the one I mentioned until now, is a significant one for, for the century, Kabbalistic teachings have become extremely popular. I always note the year 1630, right, as the beginning of the takeover. Because in 1630, the works of Rabbi Shayahu Horowitz, the Shloah Kadosh, arrive in European communities. And he was a very righteous Jew and a very special Jew. And he, being that he was in the land of Israel for the last 9 years of his life, was extremely influenced by the teachings of the Arizal. His works became popular, and therefore there's this major shift in European Jewry, where the Kabbalistic teachings become really the bread and butter of our Judaism. So to go ahead and mention that Maimonides didn't really buy into it doesn't sit well with many people. That is one reason why the guide, the Moreh Nevuchim, is controversial. But there's one other piece of information, perhaps less known, and therefore perhaps there's less of controversy. But I think this one is an important one indeed. You read Tanakh. Tanakh talks about the eyes of God. Einei Hashem. Vaishma Hashem, right? God sees. God hears. God has a hand, by the way, right? Et hayad hagdolah. So does that mean that we have to envision God as a physical entity, as a physical being, as a human? So you'll all tell me we are an educated crowd, and you know that we use human attributes to go ahead and describe the way he interacts with us, right? Anthropomorphism. We are familiar with it. Now, what is simple for us was actually a challenge for many. Because if the simple text of the Tanakh tells us that God has a hand, and we are supposed to believe every word in Tanakh, how can you as a Torah Jew say that God doesn't have a hand? You are going against Tanakh. If the Torah tells us, Einei Hashem, Elokecha ba mereshit hashana achit hashana, that the eyes of God are watching the land of Israel, who are you? What chutzpah do you have to claim that the Torah says that he has an eye? You have the chutzpah to say that he has no eye? So therefore, although we've been trained, for many this was a difficulty. And Maimonides fought against such individuals. And he tells them that you have to know how to read it. It's how he interacts, not his essence. And he sees it as a dangerous approach to Judaism when you make God into a physical entity. Karov la'avodah zarah for the Rambam. Now, so it's important. Now, this is piece of information number one before we enter into our bigger discussion. Piece of information number one is that the Rambam is teaching us that when you read the Chumash, you have to know that there are many things that are mishalim, a mashal. It is not something that is describing some as we see it. It is more of a metaphor, a parable. It is to relate to the reader. And we can understand that God is concerned about the land of Israel, so we use human eyes to go ahead and describe the interaction. Very important piece of information. Now, page 2, okay, follow. Remember this information. Let's move on to another discussion. Discussion number 2 has to do with the fact that the Rambam, Maimonides, had a tremendous amount of respect for Aristotle, of the philosopher. Maimonides is a rationalist. And we perhaps in our generation do not fully appreciate Aristotelian philosophy, but in those days, a thinker, right? One who understands that God bestowed us with the logical ability to think. And we have to obviously go back to Reb Sadia Gaon and give credit for him for arguing that, you know what, if God Almighty gave you seichel, it means that things that there are rational things and there are things that are irrational in our tradition. Aristotle was respected by Maimonides. Now, Rambam had no problem disagreeing with him as well. In one area where Maimonides disagrees with Aristotle has to do with creation. In other words, did planet Earth come into existence, or was it a world that always was in existence? Aristotle believed that the Earth was always around. Maimonides disagrees, and he tells us that there was a creation, ex nihilo, there was a creation. Now, why does, listen carefully, why does Maimonides, why does Rambam disagree with Aristotle? So the Rambam tells us in the guide, section 2, chapter 25, that you should know that my rejection or our rejection of what Aristotle believes regarding Kadmut HaOlam, don't think that that is because of verses in the Torah. In other words, don't tell me that I rejected because the Torah says, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. That's not the reason of rejecting it. I have other reasons. Now, why is a verse in the Torah not enough to reject the philosophy of Aristotle regarding creation? So the Rambam notes, because just as when we worked with human attributes of God, I told you that they are mishalim, I told you that you don't take things literally, so too, sha'arei ha-perushim are not stumim befanenu. The gates of explanations are not sealed in front of us. We could take the verses of Bereshit. We do not have an obligation to take them literally, okay? And if indeed we would believe that the world always existed, like Aristotle, if that would work into our theology, we would have no difficulty adjusting the verses. We have other reasons to reject it, and that's what the Rambam spells out. Now, how is that relevant for me? Because I want to transfer it to a third discussion. You know, there's a lot of debate regarding the age of the universe. And if someone asks me, how old is the universe? So I'll tell you it's somewhere between 5,881,000 years, right? 5,881,000 years and 13.7 billion, right? Somewhere in between the two. Now, why would I give such a funny answer? Because every single time you go to a wedding or you tune into a Zoom wedding, they get up and they declare in the document, we utter those words since creation. But then you open a work of science and you realize that even there are trees that have been around for 12,000 years. There are drawings in caves that have been around for 13,000 years. They have all kinds of scientists. The list is very, very long that seem to indicate that the world is quite older than 6,000 years. How do you deal with it? How do you deal with it? So there are those that struggle with this. I personally don't struggle with it for two reasons. Number one, if science says it now, that's fine. They might change their mind. I'm not gonna bank science could change their mind. But even if science does not change your mind, and this is what Rav Kook says, look what Maimonides tells us. The verses in Bereshit are not to be taken always literally. Lo sha'arei ha-perush stumim befanenu. In other words, if you talk about 6 days of creation, it could be 6 stages, 6 stages of the development of planet Earth. And there are many works of literature that address how each stage represents another passage from the ancient form creation, from the Big Bang to the world we are familiar with. So I do not sweat one iota due to the contradiction between the works of science and our tradition, because I have the Moreh Nevuchim. This could be controversial for some, but It's the Moreh Nevuchim that gives us guidance in this area. So far, we have two areas that we could label the work controversial, although for a good Torah Jew, I think it is a work that really enhances Judaism. And area number one related to Kabbalah, area number two related to science. The third one where we've focused over the years a lot about Rambam giving explanation to mitzvos, rational explanations, even to sacrifices, meaning sacrifices don't have some kind of intrinsic value, but something extrinsic. In other words, you, right? You, God Almighty, you want your people to relate to you. You give your Torah to a nation that's primitive. They have practices that they've been following. You cannot expect them to reject all those practices overnight. So therefore, you work with them. And since societies were pagan, and it was natural for the human being to want to bring an offering to relate to whatever supernatural entity he worships, therefore you could continue with korbanot. So we've discussed this over the years, I think many times. I think it's important not to misunderstand the Rambam. Once the Torah was given, and once in the days of Maimonides, once in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, the mitzvah had a reason. Even if times have changed, the mitzvah remains. In other words, Maimonides actually notes that you should know, if we would be familiar with all the pagan practices that existed in the region the Torah was given to Israel 3,400 years ago, we would have had a clearer understanding of all the mitzvot, because all the mitzvot are there to uproot pagan philosophy. In no way is Maimonides telling us that when the situation changes, the Torah changes, because once those were the practices needed to connect to God during Revelation, they remain the mitzvot of Revelation. But nevertheless, it's something we've discussed in the past, and I'm not going to go ahead and spend more time without specifically. You know, Nachmanides, who disagrees with Rambam, with Maimonides greatly, nevertheless had a tremendous amount of respect for him. And he even shares with us that in the days of the Rambam, Hosifu lenosach HaKadosh. You know what they added to the Kaddish? When we say B'chayachon, in other words, we talk about God revealing himself, that we merit the final redemption, and it should occur in your day, Zuviyomechon. And then they would add in the days of the Rambam, Ubechaye, the Rabban Moshe ben Maimon, meaning in the Kaddish itself, they turn to the Almighty in prayer that we should merit God's revelation to us. We should merit, right, the Geulah in our days and in the days of our great rabbi, Moshe ben Maimon. And there has always been this understanding that perhaps for those like in Spain who follow the mystical schools, they had difficulty with specific statements he makes. Nevertheless, the respect must remain. In yeshiva circles, there's always this question mark, how to deal with the Moreh Nevuchim. There's an understanding that it's a respectful text. We quote often Rabbi Meir Simcha Dvinsk. Rabbi Meir Simcha Dvinsk in the Meshech Chochmah quotes Maimonides in the guide many times. Obviously, the Ramah in his responsa quotes the guide many times. The Ramah in the first section of Shulchan Aruch, when he tells us that a person has to awaken in the morning and feel enthusiastic about the fact that he's going to serve the higher being, he quotes from Maimonides, from the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim. This is a text that really gives life. And I've gone through this text. I could be honest with you, there are sections that I did not understand. When he talks about the angels and about the Maaseh Merkavah, I did not walk away with an understanding, unfortunately. But for other sections, the beauty, the depth, and the logic are ones that uplift us. And just as he was a person that uplifted those who were going through difficulty, like as we learned with the Igeret Ashmad and Igeret Teman, it's an uplifting text that I think that we have to always appreciate and value. It's interesting how the work, the Moreh Nevuchim, was actually written in Arabic. Now, there was a desire for people, especially living in southern France, in Provence, to become familiar with the thinking of the Rambam. So there was a translation, my fellow Baden Shmuel Ibn Tibon, who translated it in the days of the Rambam. But it's not known as a precise translation, and there have been several other translations over the years. About 50 years ago, there was a Yemenite rabbi by the name of Rabbi Kapach, who translated Maimonides' work into a modern Hebrew from Arabic, and he won the Pras Israel for it. And about 20 years ago, there was a professor by the name of Michael Schwartz, who again translated the original Arabic Moreh Nevuchim into a modern Hebrew, and a real modern Hebrew. Like he uses words like intuatia. In other words, he'll translate it with the Hebrew they use today in Israel. And he also won Pras Israel for his translation. And I don't think there has been any, when it comes to prizes in literature, I don't think you will find anywhere else that you could have two people who get the most prestigious prize in a country for translating the same work. It indicates that this is a text that we should appreciate, and those that have the ability to read, and there's access that we have today to the works of Maimonides. Obviously, this is like a drop in the bucket of a person that influenced our Judaism. We have to remember that our halachic practices are basically, if you look at Shulchan Aruch, will tell you that if the Rambam says something and Rabbi Yitzchak Elfasi agrees, that will be halacha. So I reversed the historical order, but the point is the influence of Maimonides on how we practice our Judaism and how we think about Judaism really indicates that this is the man that shaped our Judaism. And there are, in my humble opinion, no reason to believe that it is a text only for Gedolei Israel. Perhaps the Gedolei Israel, as Dr. Peccary shared with us, could understand more than I do. But I think all of us can walk away with something from a fascinating work that is studied every single day and appreciated and will be appreciated ad biat goel tzedek. Rambam, according to tradition, is buried in Tveria. I don't know if he would want us to go to Tveria and make it into an aliyah laregel. I think he wouldn't be so happy. But I think that if you do land up in Tveria and you could take out the work of Mishnah, of the Pirush HaMishnah of the Rambam or the Moreh Nevuchim and study it there, I think he'll give you a pass. But just don't you dare pray to him, because then you're messing with the Rambam, because you're going against his way of practice. Okay, that's